Let's talk about successful implementation planning with Dave Saraiva. Hello, and welcome to Driven's Fundraising Superheroes podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Shishente, and as an innovator in nonprofit technology, our team at Driven is determined to help you unlock your true fundraising potential. Please give us a visit at trustdriven.com if you'd like to learn more. We'd love to talk fundraising with you. When your organization is shopping for new fundraising software, how much time do you dedicate to the implementation process? Software implementation is crucial to setting up your organization for success with your new tool because your data has to be handled with care. The state of your database can drastically impact the time and resources needed for implementation, so it's crucial that you're spending that time to ensure that everything will run smoothly. I'm so excited to have our CEO and head of product, Dave Saraiva, on the show. He is a true professional and is helping nonprofits gain back hours of time through inefficient software and data silos. Not only is he a tech whiz, but Dave has worked closely with nonprofits to help them find fundraising success, especially with their implementations. So thank you so much, Dave, for joining the show today.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be here.
So can you start off by explaining why nonprofit implementation is so crucial to the overall setup and success of new software?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the thing with these systems, the software that many nonprofits use, and this is more true the more complex the software is, and sort of the bigger the use case, the setup often informs how successful the actual use of the software will be for years to come. Meaning, if you're setting up something that's sort of going to run a significant portion of the important functions of the nonprofit, and that's not set up correctly on day one, you may save money, you may save a little bit of time at that time, but it's going to cost you for years to come. Essentially, often the life of that software product, because it can be very difficult to go back and fix things, that sort of decisions that were made at the start. And the longer you sort of use it in one way, the harder it can be to change what's been done in the past.
Yeah, when you're starting with something new, you definitely have to be really careful of how you're implementing that information. What should organizations be expecting during this process? Is there kind of like a standard that is like across the industry?
There's a couple of ways that it's done. So here at Driven, we have sort of like a very white glove concierge level of service where, there's a dedicated project manager who is an expert in the software who will sort of guide you through those, the implementation, and sort of talk about marry their knowledge of our system with sort of your knowledge of your organization, and sort of, bringing those two together to make sure that your organization is set up for success from day one. Eliminating risk is very big for us, and that's one of the ways that we do it. Some other popular models are sort of like a do-it-yourself. So you'll sort of purchase the software from a vendor, and then someone from your organization will go in and fill out all of the different configuration options and make all of the choices sort of in a bubble, and launch the software. And then sort of the third common model is sort of via like a vendor or an agency. This typically comes into play with sort of like more complicated, more sort of powerful solutions like Razor's Edge or Engaging Networks or Salesforce. And there you'll not only buy the software, but you'll also engage the services of a third party sort of implementation specialist in that software. And they'll sort of ideally fulfill that sort of concierge role where they walk you through the implementation and sort of provide that expertise to you.
Yeah, you talked about risks, and that definitely, I think that's the biggest fear that anyone has when they're switching tools. Can you go over some of the most common challenges, issues, complaints that organizations face when they're experiencing like a data migration?
Yeah, I mean, changing of significant systems is always scary. It doesn't matter, what product you're going to, who's involved. It's always a scary proposition to sort of significantly change how things are done. But sometimes it's necessary, right? So the things that you need to look at are basically making sure that the project has enough resources to be successful. And that's not just sort of money, right? Um, Time needs to be invested on your side of the table as the organization implementing the software to make sure that what you need is being communicated clearly, right? And you also need to make sure that sort of there's enough on the vendor side to provide the support that you need. That may look like having, very robust documentation to sort of allow you to support yourself in a self-implementation. And it may mean, an agency partner or a company like us that does concierge implementations, there to sort of walk you through the parts of the system that are going to be new to you, that are going to be different from what you do today, and sort of can explain those differences so that the decisions that are made will serve you in the long run, as opposed to just sort of getting you through the implementation. And when it comes to risk, sort of one of the biggest things that can happen is just sort of never actually launching, which is something that's not terribly uncommon, right? There are projects that begin and just fail for whatever reason. And it's typically sort of lots of reasons that can play into that, but that's one of the biggest risks when you're like making a significant software change. So it's important that sort of whoever's involved, whether it's all internal or a mixture of internal and external resources that are participating, that sort of there's experience and understanding of sort of how to mitigate that risk as best as possible, and sort of set your organization up for success from day one when you launch that new software.
It sounds like communication between like the organization and the vendor is like almost critical. Like you have to streamline that somehow.
Communication is absolutely critical, ensuring that sort of the resources you have on your side are willing to take accountability for the responsibilities that will fall on your lap as the organization. Mm-hmm. Also hold, the vendor that you've chosen accountable for sort of the promises and the deliverables that they're making. There's a lot that comes into play there for sure.
Mm-hmm. I know when we were discussing implementations like within our company, one of the things that we do that really sets us apart is that we actually look at the quality of the data before we give quotes, before we can make promises. What are some things that organizations can do to kind of help them in that like assessment stage? Like how can they make it as easy for their vendors as possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy answer, right? I mean, that's not true. It is an easy answer. It's just not an especially exciting one, right? Because the problem is where you go wrong is sort of years of bad data process, right? Mm-hmm. Bad data practices where, someone joined the organization and they did things one way, and then they left on to another thing, and someone else joined and they did things in a slightly different way. And then a third person came and they did things in yet a slightly different way. And so now everything's kind of all over the place. You can unify that down into sort of one common way of doing things. The problem is, when you're like sort of looking at, say 5-10 years of sort of no specific process in place for managing your data and keeping it consistent, is not an easy fix. It can take significant amounts of time, and sometimes there is capacity for that organizationally, and that's great because you can do that work and save the cost of sort of paying someone else to do that. But sometimes there just isn't the resources from a time perspective to do that, and there isn't really a choice but to get someone to help with it, right?
So we kind of touched on, how different organizations handle the implementation, whether they're hands-on or hands-off. But from your experience, how involved should an organization's chosen vendor be? And do you have any tips on how, organizations can advocate for themselves with their vendors?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say from our perspective, the ideal situation is to have a vendor that sort of is going to take that responsibility and have and take full ownership of every aspect of the project. There's inherent value for the organization when that happens, right? That's why we've gone this path. That's why that's why we offer that. Like that's the solution with our product. I think there's certainly great business reasons to sort of do it the other ways, right? When you're doing a self-implementation or a agency supported implementation to spend, depending on where the complexity of your solution is on the spectrum, right? That's great for you as a vendor, right? Because you sell the software and then sort of your part is essentially, you've met your obligations, right? Because you've provided the software. And if there's problems if there's problems with your implementation and the client is using a third-party vendor to support that implementation, that's their fault, right? So I think there's, like I said, great business reasons to do that. We didn't found this company just to sort of become very profitable and successful. We wanted to sort of intentionally look at things in a bit different way and sort of look at what makes sense for the user, for the organizations that are going to be buying our product versus what's the most advantageous business decision here. And that's sort of a common theme at our sort of discussions in our leadership team, right? It's not just about how much money we can make, but about sort of looking at what makes the most sense and provides the best outcome for our partners and those that choose to join us on our platform.
So kind of going back a little bit, there's so much information that you gave on kind of navigating through the process, but where does it start when organizations are shopping for their software? It's so common to be sold on this idea of like quick implementation, seamless, it'll be easy, but you don't really know until you assess the state of your database. So what terms or promises should organizations look out for when they're shopping around?
Well, that's a really big topic, and probably not something where you can touch on all of the aspects in a couple of minutes. But there's certainly a lot to unpack there. And I'd say, honestly, any comprehensive system is not going to be easy and quick to implement. And anyone that sort of says that they will do that, corners are being cut somewhere, right? Whether the system isn't as comprehensive as you think, or sort of there isn't sort of the same degree of ability to customize it to sort of your branding and organization or other areas. There's just trade-offs, right? Like you can, these things take time, right? So if you're going to do it quicker, there's going to be trade-offs, and that's just sort of something to keep in mind when vendors are making promises in the sales prospects or in the sales, sort of stage of the decision-making process. And that's something that I always advocate to remember or advocate for, when you're buying anything, to remember in that stage, right? When you're deciding to buy, but have not yet decided to buy, that is the best customer service you will ever get ever in that relationship, right? Even if it's just a tiny little drip down, it's not going to get better after you've made the decision that they want you to make. So that I find is like a really sort of high level, easy way to gauge how things are going. Because if they're not caring about sort of meeting deliverables and providing what they said they would and so on in the sales process, how can they be expected to do that after you've made the decision, right? And then sort of on the whole number of different things that you can look at when you're making this type of decision, right? What type of vendor to buy. We actually have a very great guide that you actually helped create, Sabrina. And that maybe we can link in the show notes and share with people, because it's an excellent, sort of very editorial outline of like, here's the questions to ask and here's the things that you should look at. I think it's like, it's quite large, right? There's a lot of content there. So that's probably what I'd recommend people get that guide and go through it, because it'll give you some really great ammunition of sort of how to navigate that process successfully and set yourself up for success.
Yeah, it really is helpful for those looking to shop for new software, because there is a lot of things that you need to look out for, especially when you're not like equipped with the knowledge or really strong technical background. It's easy to kind of fall into the habits or the beliefs that other vendors give you. Before we go, I would love to hear if there's any key questions you feel organizations should be asking for. I think that contracts are huge. when you're signing on to a new product? That's like the in writing. So is there any advice you can give there?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the size of the vendor, there's generally not a whole lot of flexibility you can expect to get in the contract, but it is important to know what you're signing up for. I know we've talked to um, uh, potential customers that are sort of wanted to come on our platform, and then when they dug into the contract that they had signed, they realized that they were on a 3-year term, and they had like a year and a half or 2 years left, and they just couldn't do anything because they're stuck, right? So definitely make sure you evaluate and go through that and make sure it's something that you know what you're signing, right? And I know that may sound like common sense, but sometimes it doesn't happen, right? You just sort of skip that step, and it's an important step to follow. But honestly, the thing that you should be looking for is the vendor that you are considering to be actually taking the lead and asking those questions, right? And diving into your use case and making sure that they're not glossing over the detail, and they're sort of understanding what is important to your organization. This is another thing that comes into play with CRMs, right? Vendors, and I mean, sometimes I'm guilty of this as well, will want to show all of the like bells and whistles and the exciting things that like, look at this really neat, powerful thing that my software can do. And that stuff's all great, but you don't want to get away from the fundamentals of like, these are the most important things that my organization does, and make sure that that is supported, right? And a good vendor should be asking those questions in the sales phase, right? Not trying to rush you to sign a contract and start implementing on the software, but making sure that there's a good fit there and that it's going to meet your organization's needs. Because surprises are great for birthdays, but after a contract's been signed is the worst surprise in the world, right? Oh, we needed this and we didn't talk about it, and now our platform can't even do that for you, or our platform can do that, but it's going to cost 25% more than you've already signed, and you didn't budget for that. So now you're in a big, in an awkward position. So, I tend to see sort of, and it's not everybody, but I do tend to see a lot of vendors trying to like push to the like, let's get this signed as quickly as possible. And sometimes when your use case is very straightforward and there's no nuance and no complexity, that's okay. But it is really important to make sure that you're exploring, especially in a large project, as much as you can, because things will get missed, and that can create a problem when you're in the implementation phase, right? It can add additional cost, it can add time frame, additional time on the end of the project. And so if if just a little bit gets through, then it's okay, it's not going to be the end of the world. But like if there isn't enough exploration and understanding of what your organization's needs are, it can sort of spell disaster for a project, because you can run into major cost overruns, major budget overruns, and you're sort of already on the hook at that point, right? Because if you've made a significant investment, you've signed a contract, and the use case that you have that is critical to your organization hasn't been outlined, it hasn't been documented in that contract, what do you do other than sort of start over, or do what you need to do to, from a cost perspective, to get it done. So that's really what you should be, one of the top things to look for, right? Whoever is trying to sell the system should be taking that leadership role and taking you through that, and asking those questions, and doing that exploration.
Oh, totally. One of the things that really stood out to me when I was talking with Farah about implementations, or director of partnerships, is that she was telling a story of how she was in like a demo call, and she was asking people about their data, and they're like, oh, you're the first person to ask me these questions. And she's like, why is no one else asking these questions? Like, these are really critical questions. So I totally agree. I think it's important that, you're getting into the nitty gritty and you're putting it all out on the table before you sign anything, because it's the only way you're going to get your real answers.
Yeah, and like, yes, these things like slow down the process and make it take a little longer to get from that initial call to the sign. And sometimes that's frustrating for you as the customer. And I assure you, it's frustrating for the vendor, because we all want to make sales, but at the end of the day, right, the sort of trend in technology to sort of rush to growth as quickly as possible and sign deals as quickly as possible, and accelerate. it comes at a cost. We don't want our customers to be paying that cost. We want to put the effort in up front to make sure that we do as much as we can on our end to ensure each and every project is successful.
Well, before we sign off today, is there any final words you'd like to say to those listening on implementations?
I'd say download the guide. I
Yeah.
think it's an excellent resource if you're shopping, and I think it's important today more now than ever with all of the market consolidation we're seeing. Vendors being rolled up into one super company that sort of owns everything. That's happening all over, and when market consolidation happens, the new owners sort of look at sharpening the pencils and finding out how they can make more revenue. It generally comes at the expense of the customer. So, those questions are more important today than they've ever been. So,
to get in touch with Dave and learn more about successful implementation planning, make sure to visit trustdriven.com. There you can sign up for our newsletter, get the latest tips and tricks for fundraising, marketing, and more delivered straight to your inbox. I've also included a link to our guide that goes over all the red flags you need to know before shopping for nonprofit software. So you can find that in the description box below. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Fundraising Superheroes podcast.